Hello. Today we're talking about Dante's Paradiso. As usual, I have lots of visual scenes prepared for you, so stay tuned for that and subscribe. Now, Paradiso is the third part of the Divine Comedy, so if you haven't watched my videos on Inferno and Purgatorio, then I highly encourage you to do so. And before we start, I need to give you a little introduction to Beatrice, because while in previous parts Dante was guided by Virgil through hell and purgatory, now he's going to be guided by Beatrice through paradise. But who exactly is she? Well, I'm very glad that you've asked. Beatrice Portinari was an Italian woman whom Dante knew since childhood. But he did not really know her, as he had only met her like 2 times in his life. And apparently they didn't even talk to each other, like ever. So yeah, that's the story of Beatrice. But no, in all seriousness, she became Dante's muse for the rest of his life, and that helped him with writing Paradiso. So now we finally begin the story with Dante writing that he went to heaven and he saw things that he's unable to put into words, but he will try his best with the blessing of Apollo. The story begins with Dante ascending with Beatrice from the earthly paradise, where we ended the story in Purgatorio, to heaven. And as they do so, Beatrice gazes at the sun with the intensity of an eagle, which Dante is not really able to fully imitate, as his eyes are too sensitive to the light. And this is something that you actually want to remember, because Dante's sensitivity to light is one of the key themes of Paradiso. Now, as they ascend, Dante begins to hear beautiful harmonies, and he also notices that the surroundings are bathed in a great light that evokes a profound longing within him. Seeing his confusion, Beatrice explains that they are no longer on earth, as they have ascended to heaven faster than the speed of light. She then explains the God's order on earth, saying that everyone is guided by it through their instinct and desires. However, humans can stray from their perfect path if they get tempted by the earthly desires. After that, Dante warns the readers that this is the last moment for them to turn back if they are not believers or if their faith is not too strong. Following that, we finally get to the first location and we find ourselves on the moon. Here, Dante looks around and he's immediately mesmerized by some faint lights in front of him, and so, thinking that those are just some reflections, he turns around only to find no one behind him. And so he then looks to Beatrice, who tells him that he's confused because he's still blind to the truth. She then explains that the faint lights are in fact real souls who belonged to those who broke their vows during their life, and as a result, they were inconsistent and lacked the virtue of fortitude. Dante begins to speak with them, and this is when we meet Picarda. She was a nun whom Dante probably knew personally, as she was a sister of his dear friend. And her story is that in her youth, Picarda fled her home to become a nun, but later she was forcefully removed from her convent because her family insisted on her marrying a man for political reasons. Now, as Dante is talking with Picarda, he notices that she's extremely happy, even though she is in the lowest sphere of heaven, and so he asks her if she ever wishes to be higher, to be closer to God. But to this, Picarda answers that the souls in heaven are at peace and they can only desire what they already have, as otherwise their will would not be aligned with God's will, and that's just not possible in heaven. Picarda then mentions another soul residing in the sphere called Constance of Sicily, and like Picarda, she was forcefully removed from her convent to be married. After praising Constance for a while, Picarda begins to sing Ave Maria and then she vanishes. So Dante looks back to Beatrice, but her light is so radiant that he's barely able to look at her. But Beatrice notices that he has some questions, as she's essentially reading his mind, and so she begins to answer them. His first question is, why does the violence of others diminishes the merit of their victims, to which which Beatrice answers that everyone is responsible for their own will, and both Picarda and Constance were able to return to their convents, but they didn't. The second question is about the souls returning to their stars, as Plato had an idea like that, and Beatrice explains that in heaven, everyone feels the same pure bliss, and the spheres only appear to be separated just for the limited understanding of a human. She also adds that the greatest gift given to humanity is free will, and now if you make a vow, then you basically sacrifice this greatest gift to God, and that's why breaking a vow is so bad. Following that, we learn that Beatrice and Dante ascend to the second sphere of heaven, which is the planet Mercury. This sphere is designed for those who were ambitious, but unfortunately this ambition caused them to be deficient in the virtue of justice. Here, Dante and Beatrice encounter 1,000 bright lights moving towards them with great joy. And as they get closer, one soul steps forward, and it turns out to be Emperor Justinian, who begins to talk a bit about his life. And in general, Justinian believed that Christ only had one nature, the divine nature, and not the human nature, which is a big no-no. However, a pope later corrected him, and from that point, Justinian dedicated his life to his holy mission given to him by God. He then basically recalls the whole history of the Roman Empire, and after that, both Justinian and the souls begin to sing, and they disappear in the distance. And now, Beatrice once again reads Dante's mind, and she reveals that he has a question about how to get revenge in the right way, because remember that this sphere is for the deficient justice. So Beatrice begins to explain by saying that Jesus' death on the cross was both just and unjust. It was unjust because Jesus was sinless, and so because of that he did not deserve to suffer. Yet it was just because it served as a punishment for the original sin. And so it basically means that God works in mysterious ways, and so just because something seems unjust from the perspective of humans, it does not necessarily mean that it's unjust from the perspective of God. But now, the destruction of Jerusalem that happened after Jesus' death is just because it punished the unjust humans and not the divine plan that was just. Yeah. Okay. You can see that I'm blonde. I'm lying to you. I'm not a redhead. I'm a blonde. Slavic blonde. Surprise. Following that, they ascend to the third sphere, this one located on Venus. Now, this sphere is for those who were lovers, but at the same time, they were deficient in the virtue of temperance. And here, Dante notices some lights moving in circles, some slower and some faster, which he believes reflects the different levels of insight. Then, some of the lights approach Dante, and one soul speaks, saying that the love here is so abundant that it would be a pleasure to rest for a while and accompany Dante and Beatrice. To this, Dante asks who is the soul speaking to him, and the spirit introduces itself as Charles Martel. Martel begins to complain about his brother, who, despite being born to a generous father, became extremely greedy, which eventually led to his downfall. After hearing this, Dante asks how is it possible that from such a sweet seed grew such a bitter form? And Martel replies that everything is part of a divine plan which assigns different roles to everyone in society. But the problem with humanity is that we force ourselves into roles that are not aligned with our soul's purpose, and because of that you have kings who should be preachers and vice versa. Now, after Martel Martel finishes his explanation, Dante is approached by another soul, this one named Konitsa. She explains that she resides on Venus because the brilliance of this planet overwhelmed her when she was alive. And that basically ties to the fact that she managed to get married 3 times during her life, and on top of that, she also had a couple of shorter romances. But she had a very tender heart, so that's okay. And the fact that Konitsa is in heaven confirms what Martel was talking about when it comes to everyone having their own purpose that transcends the influence of their families. Because Konitsa actually had a brother who is now in hell for being a very bad ruler. Now, Konitsa adds that her earthly passions no longer bother her here, and after that she flies away and another soul comes up to Dante. The soul introduces himself as Folco, saying that he too was consumed by the earthly passions during his life, but he does not regret them, as in heaven you don't even remember your sins, you just smile at the power of God. Folco then mentions that Rahab, the one from the Old Testament, is also here, and at the end he declares that Florence is an offshoot of Satan, and he criticizes the city for producing and spreading the golden coins which lead people astray, turning shepherds into wolves. He then adds that soon the Vatican will be purified of this corruption, and after that he disappears. Following that, they find themselves on the Sun, a sphere reserved for those who embodied prudence. Now, as you might expect, the surroundings here are extremely bright, to the point where Dante doesn't even recognize any colors, as everything seems to be purely white. And here Beatrice tells him to give thanks to God who has raised him to this level of understanding. Dante does so, and he feels such immense amount of gratitude in his heart that he actually forgets about Beatrice for a moment. They then see a bunch of souls flying up towards them and then circling them 3 times, after which one soul emerges from the others. It introduces itself as Thomas Aquinas and notes that the soul next to him is his former teacher Albert the Great. Aquinas then points to some other souls that reside in the sphere, and among them we can see figures like King Solomon and Peter Lombard. At this point, Dante reflects on the foolishness of the human mind, which seeks things like politics, philosophies, and the pleasures of the flesh, and he feels great joy from freeing himself from those illusions by ascending to heaven with Beatrice. The souls then gather together, standing for a moment like candles in a candlestick, and after that Aquinas begins to speak. Now, he explains something for which I will actually give you a legend on the side. So we have the church as a bride and then Christ as her beloved. And now you have to imagine that the bride is walking towards her beloved, but she's not alone, as she's guided by 2 princes sent by God. One prince has a nature of a seraphim, which is sort of like a burning love, and the other prince has a nature of a cherub, which is more like a great intellect. Then Aquinas begins to praise Saint Francis of Assisi, who angered his wealthy father by falling in love with Lady Poverty, who's said to be the widow of Jesus. And while Francis fully embraced poverty, unfortunately many of those who wanted to follow in his footsteps eventually strayed from his path, chasing after wealth instead. After Aquinas finishes speaking, another soul emerges, this one of Saint Bonaventure, who begins to praise Saint Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order. Dominic is described here as a great teacher who strived for heavenly things instead of earthly things, but unfortunately the men who went in his footsteps lost their way to worldly desires. And now you see, the thing is that Aquinas, the one who was praising Saint Francis, was actually a Dominican, while Saint Bonaventure, the one praising praising Saint Dominic was a Franciscan. So basically they were praising the orders they didn't really agree with during their lifetime. And the idea behind that is that once you are in heaven, you are so full of love that you finally realize that both sides were equally important for the greater purpose. Which is exactly why Aquinas was talking about two princes guiding the church to Christ, which is actually pretty sweet. I've been learning a bit about the Christian denominations recently, and it's a very nice way to look at them like this, I think. So next, Beatrice reads Dante's mind and she reveals that he's wondering whether the souls will remain illuminated just as they are now, even after the day of the last judgment. In response, King Solomon answers that their light will never fade. In fact, after the day of the last judgment, it will grow even brighter, along with their ability to see God more clearly. Following that, they ascend to the fifth sphere, this one located on Mars and reserved for the warriors of the faith, those who embodied the virtue of fortitude. As they rise, Dante struggles to look into the light, and so he turns to Beatrice, who is so beautiful and radiant that her smile reassures him, allowing him to look forward again. He first gives thanks to God for lifting him higher, and then he notices that the red souls of this sphere seem to form a massive cross. Dante then writes that upon this cross he saw Christ, but only as a light so intense that he's not even able to begin to describe it. And from the cross he hears a beautiful hymn, which he's also not able to describe. Now, Dante is just completely captivated. He just stares at the cross, listens to the hymn, and he's unable to look away, as he has never felt such intense and pure joy before. And he also notes here that the higher they ascend, the less drawn he is to Beatrice, but she doesn't really mind that. In fact, she welcomes it because she herself is completely filled with the eternal love, and so she understands that Dante's focus on God is exactly how it should be. Now, as they continue staring at the cross, the music suddenly stops, and from the right side of the cross, a star descends to its foot, and it turns out to be a soul. At first, the soul speaks in such profound terms that Dante can barely understand anything, but after a while it lowers its tone to much human understanding. The soul explains that it can read Dante's thoughts, and he encourages him to ask the question that he wants to ask, as he already has the answer. Dante hesitates for a moment, but then he looks at Beatrice, who smiles at him so beautifully that he instantly gets more confident, and so he asks for the soul's identity. And it turns out to be Cacciaguida, who was Dante's great-great-grandfather. He says that his son, so Dante's great-grandfather, is still circling the mountain of purgatory for his sin of pride. And so because of that, he needs very frequent prayers so that he can ascend more quickly. Then Cacciaguida goes on to praise the older, simpler days of Florence, when people were still full of virtue, because nowadays everything went bad and people lost their virtues, and it's basically the end of the world. Which is kind of a theme, isn't it? Like, the older generations always say that the younger generations are bad and like deprived of virtues, but like at the same time you can see this thing, this phenomena, even in the medieval times. So is it really true? After that, they stand in silence for a while, but Beatrice, reading Dante's thoughts, knows that he's wondering about his future. Especially since some souls in hell and purgatory have already hinted at his upcoming exile. She encourages him to ask freely, not because they don't already know what he's thinking about, but because it's very important for him to learn how to ask for help when he needs it. Dante then asks about his future, and Cacciaguida tells him that he indeed will be exiled and that relying on others will be very difficult for him. But in the end, justice will prevail and consequences will fall on everyone who treated him poorly. After hearing this, Dante begins to worry whether he should really write down his entire journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, as he wonders if the things he's learned might be too triggering for some people, and he fears that he might lose his last connections over it. But Cacciaguida encourages him, saying that he should speak boldly, even if the truth is uncomfortable, because even if his words sting at first, eventually they may help someone after they reflect on them. To this, Dante just wonders for a while, and then he hears Beatrice speaking, and so he turns to her, and he's completely mesmerized by the amount of love that she has in her eyes. And as he's gazing at her, he feels every other desire leave his body. But to this, Beatrice gently tells him that paradise isn't just found in her eyes. So Dante then looks around, and Cacciaguida begins to point out some specific souls that form the cross. Among them, he names Joshua, Maccabeus, Roland, and many others. Then Cacciaguida returns to the cross, and Dante realizes that Beatrice has swiftly taken him to the sixth sphere of heaven, which is located on Jupiter. And this sphere is reserved for rulers who embodied justice. Words that spell out diligite justitiam qui. Oh my, that's so bad. I actually studied Latin for some time, but not very seriously, like it was just a class that I had when I was studying literature. But do I remember much of it? I'm not going to answer that. As Dante looks around, he notices that the bright stars of the sphere form words that spell out Diligite justitiam qui judicatis terram, which means love justice, you who judge the earth. Then the last M of the sentence transforms into a giant eagle, and upon seeing it, Dante prays that those who corrupt the church will face justice, as back in the days, wars were fought with swords, and now they are fought with excommunication. Then, as Dante is staring at the eagle, he suddenly hears voices of all the souls forming it, speaking as one. The eagle says that humans can't fully comprehend God's justice, and then it senses that Dante has a question about the people who lived their whole lives without sin, but at the same time they were born in places where they couldn't possibly know about Christ. In response, the eagle says that there's no one in heaven who did not have the belief in Christ. However, there's many of those in hell who believed in Jesus, but at the same time, their hearts were very distant from him. And these people will be judged more harshly than those who just never knew about Christ. And I actually mentioned this concept in Inferno, so if you haven't watched that, then you can. The eagle then points out some Christian kings who in reality were not very Christian in their hearts, and after that, the bird begins to sing a song. When the song ends, the eagle tells Dante to look into its eye, as this is where the greatest examples of justice reside. And there, Dante sees figures like King David, Trajan, and Constantine. And Dante is actually pretty surprised to see Trajan here, but to this, the eagle explains that others prayed for him so much that God gave him the grace to believe and be baptized. Finally, the eagle says that no human can peer into predestination, as even the souls in heaven are not entirely sure who the chosen ones are, and so because of that, people on earth should be especially careful about judging others. But now, for the souls in heaven, this is actually a pretty sweet thing, as because they're content with whatever God's will is. And Dante actually feels a little better after hearing this. Following that, Dante and Beatrice ascend to the 7th sphere of heaven, and as they're doing so, Dante is of course mesmerized by Beatrice's beauty. But this time she's not smiling, and she explains that if she were to smile, then Dante would be so overwhelmed that he would turn to ashes, because basically her beauty intensifies the higher they get. And so she has to soften her beauty so that Dante doesn't get too overwhelmed. Now we find ourselves on Saturn, which is reserved for the contemplatives, who embodied the virtue of temperance. Dante looks around and he notices a huge ladder disappearing into the sky. He also sees countless bright lights descending the ladder, but he doesn't say anything yet as he's waiting for Beatrice to guide him. After a moment, she encourages him to speak his heart desires, and to this he asks, why is the sphere so silent? The souls respond that Dante still has mortal senses, which are too sensitive to the overwhelming beauty of paradise, and so the souls don't sing for the same reason Beatrice doesn't smile, which is to protect Dante for being too overwhelmed. Dante then asks another question, wondering why this particular soul was chosen to speak with him, and to this the soul answers that this was simply the God's will, which should not be questioned as no one can fully comprehend it. And he also adds that humans should not aim so high to understand God's will, as if the souls in heaven are not able to fully grasp it, then it's just simply not possible for a mortal human to understand anything so profound. The soul then introduces itself as Peter Damian, who was a very humble monk when he was alive. But unfortunately, his successors are nothing like him, as they now live with servants and lavish lifestyles, and after he says this, the souls on the ladder begin to lament. And as they do so, Dante looks at Beatrice like a scared child, but to this she reassures him, saying that nothing in heaven has bad intentions, and so because of that he shouldn't be afraid of the lamenting souls. She encourages him to look back at the souls. Dante does, and this is when he notices Saint Benedict, who praised the life of humility and poverty. And Saint Benedict laments here about the state of the church, and especially about the monks getting overweight. And then he adds that the good beginnings don't really mean that much if you eventually stray from your path. After that, he returns to the ladder, and Beatrice urges Dante to follow. He does so, and with that they ascend to the 8th sphere of heaven, which is a bit different than the previous ones, because this sphere is for the fixed stars, and so now they find themselves specifically under the constellation of Gemini, which was Dante's astrological sign. Here, Dante expresses gratitude for being born as a Gemini, because that apparently gave him the talents that he had. He then looks down at Earth beneath him, and he reflects a bit about his whole journey so far. After that, he looks back at Beatrice, who is still gazing at the stars with anticipation, and so he follows her gaze. There, he sees the sky growing brighter and brighter, and Beatrice explains that the glowing light is Christ himself, and she's so overwhelmed with joy that Dante is not even able to describe it. Dante then looks at Christ, but the light is almost too intense for him to handle, and so he turns back to Beatrice, who is now smiling, as Dante is finally able to see her smile. And of course, it's so beautiful and resembles paradise so much that Dante is not even able to describe it. Now, under the light of Christ, Dante sees the Virgin Mary and several other saints. And in general, Dante is just overwhelmed by everything around him as the souls sing hymns to Mary. Then Beatrice speaks to the souls and asks them to give Dante some of the wisdom that they have. One bright flame emerges from the group, then circles Beatrice 3 times, and then introduces itself himself as Saint Peter. He begins to test Dante on his faith, asking him questions about faith, hope, and love. So the first question is obviously, what is faith? And to this, Dante quotes Saint Paul, explaining that faith is the substance of the things we hope for and evidence of those that are not seen. To this, Saint Peter is like, well, you explain it well, but do you have it in your heart? And Dante says that yes, his faith is indeed very strong, as he got it through the Holy Spirit by reading the scripture. He then talks a little longer about his faith, and after that he passes the test. So Saint Peter circles him 3 times, and after that everyone begins to sing. After they stop, Dante wonders if he'll ever see Florence again, and after that another soul approaches them and introduces itself as Saint James. And he's here to test Dante's virtue of hope, which he does by asking him what hope is and where does it come from. And before Dante answers, Beatrice says that there's no one on earth who has hope greater than Dante, which is exactly why he was allowed to see Jerusalem before his earthly journey is done. And then Dante answers himself, saying that hope is the certain expectation of future glory, which is the effect of grace divine and merit precedent, and adding that his hope is strengthened by reading the Bible, and that his biggest hope in life is to develop a very deep relationship with God. Then an intensely bright light approaches the 2 other saints, and it turns out to be Saint John. And the light emanating from him is so strong that Dante loses his sight for a moment and he's not able to see Beatrice. But to this, Saint John reassures Dante, telling him not to worry, as Beatrice has the ability to heal his sight, and for now Dante should just focus on answering the questions that Saint John has for him. And the question is, what exactly is the goal of his soul? Dante answers that the goal is Christ, and that he is drawn to him through scripture and God's goodness. Then he adds that everything ultimately leads him to God as long as he's actively seeking him. Now, after he answers, the souls sing a short hymn, after which Dante regains his sight, but it's not just restored, as it's even clearer than before. He then notices a 4th light in front of him, and it turns out to be the soul of Adam. Dante is obviously amazed, and so he asks Adam to speak with him, and they begin to discuss the Garden of Eden. Adam explains that he was expelled from the garden not simply because he ate from the tree, but because it was an act of disobedience. And then he says that he was in Eden for only 6 hours, after which he lived on earth for over 900 years, and then he was stuck in hell for 4,000 years until Christ came to bring him out. And after Adam finishes speaking, all of heaven sings, which fills Dante with extreme joy. However, as they sing, one soul begins to glow in red, which makes everyone go silent. Then the red soul turns out to be Saint Peter, who condemns Pope Boniface VIII, the one who Dante didn't really like, saying that Boniface pleases Lucifer, to which now all of heaven turns red. Just like in Skyrim, when you are a vampire and you shoot an arrow to the sun. Yeah. Kind of like that. And then Saint Peter continues, saying that the church was meant to lead people towards God, but now it's corrupt and its leaders misuse their authority. However, God's justice will definitely come, and so because of that, Dante has to return to Earth to write the Divine Comedy in order to guide others. Following that, we learn that Dante and Beatrice have been lifted to the final 9th sphere of heaven, which is even more interesting than the previous one. It's called the Primum Mobile, and it doesn't have any stars. Instead, it's just full of angels, and its movement is directly powered by God's love, making it the most divine part of heaven. Here, as Dante gazes into Beatrice's eyes, he notices a bright point of light reflected in them. He gets curious, so he turns around to see it clearly, and he realizes that this single point of light is God himself. Around this divine light, 9 circles of fire spin at incredible speed, and the closer the circle is to the light, the faster it moves. Beatrice explains that everything in heaven and in nature depends on this single point of light, and then she also adds that the innermost circle moves the fastest because it's completely consumed by God's burning love. And then she starts pointing out the different types of angels that reside within each of the 9 circles, and we have here the first order with seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, the second order with dominions, virtues, and powers, and the third one with principalities, archangels, and guardian angels. And after that, Beatrice continues explaining some deeper truths about heaven. First, she clarifies that God did not create the universe out of any need or desire to gain anything for himself, as he's already perfect. Instead, he created simply so that his light could shine and affirm its existence. Then she touches on the fall of Satan, explaining that Lucifer and his angels fell from heaven because of their arrogance, believing that they could be equal to God. Meanwhile, the rest of the angels remained humble, recognizing that their ability to understand and exist was entirely a gift from God. And thanks to this, their sight became even clearer and their will became perfect. Beatrice then says that some teachers on earth mistakenly believe that angels think, remember, and make decisions just as humans do, but that's not really true, as angels never turn their gaze away from God and their knowledge is already perfect. Meanwhile, on earth, people wander away from the truth, which is of course the scripture, and they get caught up in different philosophies. But even that is not as bad as intentionally rejecting the Bible or twisting it for personal gain. And then, of course, we get some criticism of the clergy, because apparently in Dante's time, priests developed a new style of preaching, which basically only included some idle stories and jokes that were meant to entertain the crowds, leaving them with nothing meaningful in the end. Following that, we learn that the divine light that was surrounding them this whole time begins to slowly fade away, leaving them in darkness. Dante turns to Beatrice, and she's so beautiful in that moment that Dante thinks that only God is able to comprehend such beauty. She then explains that they've now completely left the material universe behind and entered the pure light of intellect, where only love and joy exist in their purest forms. Then suddenly a bright light flashes around Dante, and it's so intense that it blinds him for a moment. But then he feels himself being lifted up, and when his sight returns, it's even stronger than before, as no light can blind him now. And with that, we finally enter the final part of paradise, called the Empyrean. Here, Dante sees a river of golden light lined with flowers on both sides, and also with sparks of living light rising from it. Beatrice tells him that to go any further, he has to drink from the river, and so, without any hesitation, he does just that. Now, when Dante looks up again, he notices that everything around has changed. The flowers and sparks transformed into saints and angels, while the river has turned into a sphere. And above the sphere, Dante sees an enormous white rose made up of countless saints that rest in heaven. Now, Dante gazes at the rose in awe, watching the angels who, just like bees, move back and forth between the light and the rose, while singing and worshipping God. After a while, he looks back to ask Beatrice a question, but he realizes that she's no longer with him. But in her place stands an old man who introduces himself as Saint Bernard, and he explains that Beatrice has returned to the rose where she sits upon her heavenly throne. Overcome with gratitude, Dante now thanks Beatrice for guiding him through heaven, and he prays that one day he may join her here. And Beatrice gives him a final, gentle smile before turning her gaze back to God. Saint Bernard then advises Dante to observe heaven closely, as it will prepare him for the ultimate vision, which is the sight of God himself. So Dante now turns his gaze towards the brightest point of the rose, where he sees the Virgin Mary in the form of a radiant flame, surrounded by the angels who joyfully sing her praises. And as he gazes at this vision, Saint Bernard begins to explain the hierarchy of saints in heaven. He honors Mary as the one who has healed the wound of sin that Eve first opened, and then he points out to some other women who dwell in heaven, figures like Rachel and Sarah. And then he explains that their placement within the rose depends on when they lived in relation to Christ. Because those who had faith in the future Messiah sit on one side, and those who followed him during his lifetime sit on the other. Now, as Dante continues to observe the rose, he notices some infants among the saints, and so he asks how come they have reached heaven if they were not able to make conscious moral choices. And to this, Saint Bernard explains that heaven is not reached by your own actions, but by God's grace alone. So Dante then looks back to the Virgin Mary, who is especially praised by the angel Gabriel, and then he notices some other important figures of heaven, including Adam, Moses, Saint Peter, Saint Anna, Mary's mother, and Saint Lucia. And finally, Saint Bernard begins to pray for Dante, asking for the divine grace to help him see God. As he continues his prayer, he exalts Mary, calling her the highest of the creatures, yet the most humble. He then prays to Mary for Dante to be able to see the full glory of God, and to also keep his faith strong so that he doesn't fall back to worldly temptations after he comes back to earth. After the prayer, Mary shifts her gaze from Bernard to God, and after that, Dante is drawn upward and his sight is made pure. And so what Dante sees now is beyond human comprehension, as the experience is so profound and overwhelming that he's not even able to put it into words, nor is he able to fully retain the memories of what has happened. The vision Dante experiences is very similar to a dream that leaves you with this lingering sense of sweetness, yet at the same time you're not really able to remember any of its details. In this vision, everything is bound together in a perfect unity of one eternal light. And as Dante stares longer, he begins to recognize three distinct circles that are separate, yet at the same time they are united in the same dimension. And that of course represents the Holy Trinity with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And at the heart of this divine vision, at the very center of the three circles, Dante sees a human face, which is the image of Christ himself. Dante gazes at it for a while, and then suddenly he feels a flash of great understanding that's too vast for human thought. And soon after that, his vision ends, but Dante is now at peace, his will and desire in perfect harmony with the divine. He then surrenders completely to God and ends his journey in the ultimate knowledge that at the heart of the universe is love. Why is this making me emotional? And with that, we end the story. So that was the whole story of Dante's Paradiso. Did you like it? I actually think that Paradiso is the best one of the Divine Comedy, even though I still like Purgatorio the most, because I'm personally very into this like concept of change and transformation and stuff like that. So I just personally like Purgatorio the most, but at the same time I feel like Paradiso is just different. It hits differently. It's like there's really something divine about it and something, I don't know, something pure. Which, yeah, no surprise, it's about heaven, so yeah. But yeah, I feel like Paradiso really captured a feeling of being close to God. So like it was not just a description of like, oh, heaven looks like this and we have this and that, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, I feel like Dante really captured a feeling of being close to God, and it's amazing, especially at the end. But yeah, so I really like it. I feel like Purgatorio got me more excited about the whole like idea and everything, but Paradiso really touched my heart in a different way, and it's so nice. It feels so nice. I don't know, this part is so amazing. So yeah, so now the question is, did Dante turn me Christian after reading the whole Divine Comedy and doing this videos for you? Well, yes and no, kinda. Because maybe if you've been watching my channel for some reason, and I'm saying that because like I don't really have that many viewers or anything, so you know. But maybe if you've been watching my channel, you probably know that I've been on like a journey with my faith recently, and currently I really feel like I'm ready to commit myself to Christianity, which is so weird to me. I did not expect myself to go this route in life, but here we are. And I also feel like it's such a strange coincidence that I got to this point of like accepting Jesus and Christianity in my life and everything just as I was preparing the Divine Comedy for the channel. This is such a strange coincidence. But maybe it's not a coincidence, who knows. At the same time, I feel like the journey did not really end, because like, yeah, Christianity is going to probably be my religion. At the same time, now I have to pick a denomination with which I agree with the most, and that's another journey, so never really ends. I don't know, that's going to be interesting. I've been kind of searching about the denominations recently, so we shall see where I go with that. I don't know. But no, in all seriousness, sharing my little journey with faith on the internet has been so weird to me, in a sense, because if you were to tell me like a year ago that I would share my journey through faith on the internet, I would call you crazy, because I don't do stuff like this. But apparently I do now, so yeah, that's fun. I don't know, I feel like it happened kind of on accident, because I did not really plan that. But there's just, you know, it's just, I think about religions and faith so much in my life that I feel like it just kind of spills out, because yeah, I'm mostly thinking about this stuff. So yeah, that's fun that it happened. I don't know, I'm kind of glad. Maybe I did that because someone needs to hear it, you know, I don't know. And at the same time, you know, also remember, like, what I share on the internet here, like, this is only probably 5% of what's actually going on when it comes to my life and my journey with faith, because I mention it here and there, but I don't really go into details. So yeah, so what you see on the channel, that's like 5% of what's actually going on. But yeah, for some reason I shared this little journey, I guess. So yeah, I also wanted to mention that I think that this channel probably is going to be like this, you know, with some of my stories and some of my interpretations and stuff like this, and not just plain summaries of the books, which summaries are going to be, of course, the priority, but you're also going to get my little stories and stuff. And the reason for that is that I like it. I really like to share from time to time, and so I'm going to keep doing that, and I hope that you don't mind. But now this is everything that I had for today, so subscribe. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and bye bye!